Hello everyone, Hira here. Now we are going to listen to podcast news which includes editorials. While walking in the morning or evening, while cooking, cycling or during free time you can listen. It will enhance your learning and understanding of various accents and pronunciations. Listening improves the quality of communication and comprehension. Before going ahead, I would like to welcome you all to the virtual school. A new way of learning and teaching, with the vision of let's grow together. Our mission is to learn how to learn and teach how to teach. So stay tuned. And here we go. Editorial 1. A death foretold. There is a pattern of institutional oppression behind the demise of Father Stan Swamy. It was a death his well-wishers feared would happen and one he had anticipated. Father Stan Swamy, an 84-year-old Jesuit priest, known for his service and activism in the cause of Adivasis, died 9 months into his unjust imprisonment on tenuous charges. A death that was simply allowed to happen despite being foretold by his deteriorating health in prison will weigh on the country's collective conscience for long. His age and frailty drew no sympathy from either the prosecuting agency or the trial court, which clung to the state narrative of there being grounds to believe that he was part of a Maoist plot to overthrow the government. Despite being a fit case for bail, he was denied bail, mainly due to the statutory bar on bail under the anti-terrorism law invoked against him. The best the diffident judiciary could do for him was a spell of hospitalization, even as the octogenarian pleaded that he be given interim bail to be with his friends or allowed to die in prison. The Bombay High Court did issue notice on his bail petition, observing that he was entitled to bail, but his end came in a hospital even before the matter could be taken up for final disposal. Much of the blame and accountability for his death should be on the NIA, which perversely opposed his release, and the court which could have granted interim bail weeks earlier. It was fairly obvious that his present stay, especially during the pandemic, was detrimental to his well-being. A good 2 months elapsed between the High Court seeking the NIA's response to his bail plea on medical grounds and his death. The same court had intervened to grant interim bail to Varvara Rao, another elderly co-accused, holding that bail can be granted purely on the grounds of sickness, advanced age, infirmity and health conditions, especially if incarceration amounted to endangering life. It is systemic and institutional failure that another under trial placed in similar circumstances did not get the benefit of this humane approach. A pattern of institutional oppression can be seen in the events, from the denial of a sipper in jail to his death while in custody. Two larger issues here are the questionable legality of the bail-denying feature of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the validity of the Bhima Koregaon case itself. It is time the higher judiciary examined these, especially the attempt to link a simple case arising out of violence a day after the Elgar Parishad, a commemorative event held in Pune, and an alleged Maoist plot involving lawyers, activists and human rights defenders. To make matters worse, credible reports that some of the electronic evidence gathered in this case could have been planted remotely by malware were never investigated. The call for accountability for Fr. Swamy's death rings painfully true. Thank you. Editorial 2. Cultural genocide. Canada should ensure justice for Indigenous community who suffered systemic violence. The recent discovery of hundreds of graves in Canada has put the spotlight back on its dark past, when Indigenous people faced systemic discrimination and violence. In June, the Cofces First Nation, an Indigenous organization, found 751 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school in Saskatchewan. This came a month after another indigenous organization discovered the remains of 215 children at a closed residential school in British Columbia. Canada's residential school system was a telling example of how indigenous people were treated. Between 1882 and 1996, an estimated 150,000 children were sent to residential schools that were funded by the federal government and run mostly by the Catholic Church. Most of these students were forcefully taken away from their families, and thousands never returned. In 1883, Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, defended in Parliament the system of residential schools, saying Indigenous students should be kept away from their parents, who are savages. The children were not allowed to speak their languages or practice their culture. Many were abused. An estimated 4,000 children died, mainly due to TB, malnutrition and other illnesses resulting from the squalid conditions in the schools. Despite these horrors, the residential school system continued for over a century. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a formal apology. The government also set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document the history and the lasting impact of the school system on the indigenous communities. In 2015, the commission called the violence against the indigenous students a cultural genocide. It has made 94 calls to action to different levels of the government and communities that included independent investigations and steps to protect Aboriginal rights and culture. It also asked the Catholic Church to apologize and take steps toward reconciliation. The Vatican is yet to formally apologize for the schools. Justin Trudeau, who came to power in 2015, had promised that addressing the grievances of the indigenous communities was a core agenda. But 6 years later, indigenous organizations say the authorities are half-hearted. The back-to-back discoveries of unmarked graves strengthen indigenous organizations' claims that the actual number of the dead is way above the estimates of the Commission. Mr. Trudeau has expressed guilt over the abuses. But that is not enough. His government should assist indigenous organizations to find unmarked graves. He should order investigations into the residential schools with graves to get to the bottom of the matter. Mr. Trudeau should also accelerate steps to implement all the recommendations of the Reconciliation Commission to ensure reparations are done to the country's indigenous community. Thank you. Editorial 3. Fresh stirrings on federalism as a new politics. There are factors, which if harnessed well, that can create a political moment for a principled politics of federalism. Getty Images iStock photo. Between vaccine wars, heated debates over the goods and services tax, GST, personnel battles like the fracas over West Bengal's chief secretary, and the pushback against controversial regulations in Lakshadweep, is India ready for a new federal bargain? Emboldened by victories in the recent state assembly elections, the idea of a third, federal, front is once again gaining political cash, as was evident in the Sharad Pawar organized opposition meet. The Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, since taking office, has begun to craft an ideological narrative on state rights, by reintroducing the term union into the public discourse and pushing back against increased fiscal centralization. Is this renewed emphasis on federalism a genuine opportunity for forging a new politics? Federalism in India has always had political relevance, but except for the States Reorganization Act, federalism has rarely been an axis of political mobilization. This was true even in the days of coalition politics, when state politics mattered to national electoral outcomes. Fiscal and administrative centralization persisted despite nearly 2 decades of coalition governments. Ironically, rather than deepen federalism, the contingencies of electoral politics have created significant impediments to creating a political consensus for genuine federalism. When confronted with entrenched centralization of the present regime, the challenge is, ironically, even greater. Nationalism on strong wicket. First, the rhetoric of nationalism has greater political purchase. Ideologically, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, has had relatively little patience with federalism as a device to accommodate India's multiple linguistic, religious, and ethnic identities. Post-2014, the BJP has couched its discomfiture with federalism in the grammar of development and nationalism, which has mass electoral appeal. To accelerate progress, India must become one nation, one market, one nation, one ration card, one nation, one grid. In this framing, federalism as a principle necessary for negotiating diverse political contexts and identity claims risks being equated with regionalism and a narrow parochialism that is anti-development and anti-national. Thus, a politics for deepening federalism will need to overcome a nationalist rhetoric that pits federalism against nationalism and development. This is a hard ask, especially because most regional parties have failed to uphold principles of decentralization in their own backyard. Second, and relatedly, despite a rhetorical commitment to federalism, the politics of federalism has remained contingent rather than principled. As Pratap Bhanu Mehta has pointed out over the decades, federal principles have been bent in all kinds of ways to co-produce a political culture of flexible federalism for me, but not for thee. Federalism in this rendition is reduced to a game of political upmanship and remains restricted to a partisan tussle rather than a region's genuine demand for accommodation. Especially, when claimants of greater federalism often maintain silence on unilateral decisions that affect other states. Take for instance, the downgrading of a full-fledged state in Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory in 2019, or more recently, the notification of the NCT of Delhi, Amendment, Act, 2021. This blatant undermining of states' rights hardly witnessed protest by parties that were not directly affected by these. Upholding federalism requires political maturity and a commitment to the federal principle. This is lacking in our politics. Divide among states. Third, the increased economic and governance divergence between states. Economic growth trajectories since liberalization have been characterized by growing spatial divergence. Across all key indicators, southern and western states have outperformed much of northern and eastern India, resulting in a greater divergence rather than expected convergence with growth. This has created a context where collective action amongst states becomes difficult as poorer regions of India contribute far less to the economy but require greater fiscal resources to overcome their economic fragilities. Glimpses of these emerging tensions were visible in the debates around the 15th Finance Commission, FC, when the Government of India mandated the Commission to use the 2011 census rather than the established practice of using the 1971 census to determine revenue share across states. This, southern states feared, risked penalizing states that had successfully controlled population growth by reducing their share in the overall resource pool. The 15th Finance Commission, through its recommendations, deftly avoided a political crisis, but the growing divergence between richer and poorer states remains an important source of tension in interstate relations that can become a real impediment to collective action amongst states. With the impending delimitation exercise due in 2026, these tensions will only increase. These challenges notwithstanding, the BJP's impatience with federalism affords an opportunity for regional parties to craft a new federal bargain. At one level, the BJP's homogenizing ideological project risks creating new forms of cultural alienation and associated regional tensions as occurred during the Citizenship Amendment Act protests in Assam. There is a very real possibility of the emergence of new forms of regional subnationalism, glimpses of which were visible during the recent assembly elections, particularly in West Bengal. Fiscal management. Moreover, the realities of India's macro-fiscal position risk increasing the fragility of state finances. Weak fiscal management has brought the union government on the brink of what economist Ratin Roy has called a silent fiscal crisis. The union's response has been to squeeze revenue from states by increasing cesses. Its insistence on giving GST compensation to states as loans, after long delays, and increasing state shares in central schemes. The pandemic-induced economic crisis has only exaggerated this. Against this backdrop, if harnessed well, both subnationalist sentiments and the need to reclaim fiscal federalism create a political moment for a principled politics of federalism. However, there are risks along the way. As Suhas Palshikar has argued, the politics of regional identity is isolationist by its very nature. An effort at collective political action for federalism based on identity concerns will have to overcome this risk. On the fiscal side, richer states must find a way of sharing the burden with the poorer states. States will have to show political maturity to make necessary compromises if they are to negotiate existing tensions and win the collective battle with the Union. An interstate platform that brings states together in a routine dialogue on matters of fiscal federalism could be the starting point for building trust and a common agenda. The seeds of this were planted in the debates over the 15th Finance Commission and the GST. Finally, beyond principles, a renewed politics of federalism is also an electoral necessity. No coalition has succeeded, in the long term, without a glue that binds it. Forging a political consensus on federalism can be that glue. But this would require immense patience and maturity from regional parties. Are they up to the task? Yamini Iyer and Rahul Verma are with the Center for Policy Research, CPR, New Delhi. The views expressed are personal. Thank you. Editorial 4. Venezuela's reflections on the Carabobo 200 years after a geopolitical campaign, South American states still struggle to be independent. Vijay Prashad. AFP. On 24 June 1821, Simon Bolivar, the great liberator, led his forces against the Spanish army at the Battle of Carabobo. 5 days later, Bolivar entered Caracas in triumph. The Spanish had not yet been defeated across South America, but the Spanish monarchy no longer had the will to fight back. The rest of the battles, including the Battle of Pichincha on 24 May 1822, merely finished up what Carabobo had established, namely that South America's many republics wanted to be sovereign. Bolivar's comrades assembled in Cúcuta to write a new constitution and to elect him as the president. But Bolivar would not rest. He mounted his horse, went southwards to ensure that the sovereignty of South America would be permanent. The story of Bolivar and Carabobo is deeply felt among Venezuelans of all classes. When I asked Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza about the meaning of this battle, he dug deep into the history books to explain that the Carabobo was more than a battle. It was a geopolitical campaign. After Bolivar's armies defeated the Spanish on those battlefields west of Caracas, The new states that emerged from Gran Colombia, Colombia and Venezuela, down to Bolivia, 1825, produced a dynamic sense of their own sovereignty. Carabobo was an important step towards the whole independence of South America. A decade ago, I remember hearing Hugo Chavez on Carabobo, his voice emotional, his sense of the possibilities opened up by Bolivar total. No wonder that Chavez named the process opened up by his election in 1998 as the Bolivarian Revolution, and that he named the regional process, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA. Venezuela has also celebrated the battle with a bicentennial Congress of the Peoples of the World. The theme is not the independence of South America alone. It is sovereignty for the world. The Wars of States. 200 years after Carabobo, the South American states struggle to be independent. Venezuela itself remains locked in a dangerous conflict with the United States, whose government continues to tighten the sanctions regime that inflicts harm against the Venezuelan people. Recently, the U.S. government's secondary sanctions pushed UBS to refuse to complete transactions by the Venezuelan government to the COVAX alliance so as to ensure delivery of vaccines for COVID-19. Increasingly, U.S. sanctions block the ability of Venezuela to conduct normal commercial relations with other countries. The U.S. has been able to exercise this overwhelming power over Venezuela and several other countries under unilateral U.S. sanctions, because of U.S. dominance over trade and investment, international financial systems, and global information flows. Monroe Doctrine. Just when Bolivar's armies defeated the Spanish, the U.S. President James Monroe on 2 December 1823, crafted the Monroe Doctrine. This policy suggested that now that European powers had lost their grip on the Americas, the United States of America will be the guarantor of continental stability. At that time, the US did not have the technological or military means to subordinate all of the hemisphere. In 1898, when the US intervened to remove the last vestiges of Spanish colonialism in Cuba and Puerto Rico, it took over both islands. Subsequently, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt in his corollary to Monroe's Doctrine in 1904 said that the U.S. would exercise its influence over the Americas. Military invasions from Nicaragua to Panama, 1989, and coups from Guatemala, 1954, to Bolivia, 2019, brought Monroe's speech into the world. The U.S. stand. It meant little that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said in 2013, "The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over." This statement came 4 years after the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras, and also before the U.S. coup in Bolivia. Mr. Kerry made that remark while he served under President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden. Mr. Biden, now U.S. President, has no intention of renouncing the Monroe Doctrine. His Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has interfered in the legal processes in Bolivia, put in place a former Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, agent, Lisa Kenna, as ambassador to Peru, and deepened U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. For these men, there is no evidence of a policy shift. In February 2021, UN Special Rapporteur on the Negative Impact of Unilateral Coercive Measures, Elena Duhan, wrote that due to the U.S. unilateral sanctions, the Venezuelan government revenue shrank by 99% and the country is living on 1% of its pre-sanctions income. Venezuela, she wrote, faces a lack of necessary machinery, spare parts, electricity, water, fuel, gas, food, and medicine. Over the past 6 years, 2.5 million Venezuelans have slipped into food insecurity, while electricity generation levels have fallen to 20%. Venezuelan assets frozen in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Portuguese banks amount to $6 billion. But Venezuelans remain defiant. "We stand firm," says Mr. Arriaza, who has just returned to Caracas from Moscow. Monroe is another name for unipolarity. Despite the residual power of the US, Monroe is of the past. Carabobo, for the Venezuelans, signals multipolarity. It is, they believe, the way forward. Vijay Prashad is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and chief editor of Leftward Books. Thank you. Editorial 5. Seeking a paradigm shift in mental health care whose guidance on community mental health services balances care and support with rights and participation. Recently, a high court suggested that homeless persons with health conditions be branded with a permanent tattoo when vaccinated against COVID-19, since tracking a floating population may be cumbersome. Earlier judgments have also suggested roundups of such persons to facilitate pathways into care. These are possibly well-intentioned directives, but what follows is that bewildered persons are huddled in a vehicle and admitted into shelters or mental hospitals that are usually crowded, yet lonely. What does this tell us about the way homelessness and mental illness are regarded in polite society? A responsive care system. Persons with mental health conditions need a responsive care system that inspires hope and participation, without which their lives are empty. In many countries, persons with severe mental health conditions live in shackles in their homes, in overcrowded hospitals, and even in prison. On the other hand, many persons with mental health issues live and even die alone on the streets. Three losses dominate the mental health system's narrative: dignity, agency, and personhood. Far-sighted changes in policy and laws have often not taken root, and many laws fail to meet international human rights standards. Many also do not account for cultural, social, and political contexts, resulting in moral rhetoric that doesn't change the scenario of inadequate care. Society's responses are often based on conditioning and perceptions, often verging on visceral forms of prejudice. This results in an othering of persons who seem different from dominant groups. Hence, even well-intentioned judgments could set off unintended negative, even grave, consequences. There is also the social legacy of the asylum, and of psychiatry and mental illness itself, that guides our imagination in how care is organized. Historian Sarah N. Pinto, in her account of the lunatic asylums in colonial Bombay, wrote that doctors interpreted a patient's refusal to wear clothing as a sign of morbidity, and clothing became a way of civilizing the savage, the violent Indian man, and the promiscuous Indian woman. Individual preference and indigenous culture were substituted with what the colonizer thought was appropriate. Similarly, medieval London boasted of a hospital for the care of persons with mental illness, St. Mary of Bethlehem, which soon turned into a bedlam, a poorhouse, and a site of shocking atrocities. We must understand mental health conditions for what they are and for how they are associated with disadvantage. These situations are linked, but not always so. Therefore, not all distress can be medicalized. It is against this complex background of distress arising out of medical conditions and from inequitable social systems, of good intentions and calamitous consequences, that we welcome the guidance on community mental health services recently launched by the World Health Organization. The guidance, which includes 3 models from India, addresses the issue from the same side, as the mental health service user and focuses on the co-production of knowledge and on good practices built around the key themes of crisis services, peer support, supported living, community outreach, hospital-based services and comprehensive mental health service networks. Drawing from 22 countries, these models balance care and support with rights and participation. Afia House in the US is driven by peers and offers respite to persons who have significant emotional or mental distress. People can stay for up to 7 nights when they are connected to networks that support recovery. Services are non-coercive and persons can opt to stay or leave based on discussions with peer supporters. Tupu Ake, a New Zealand-based recovery house service, welcomes guests from various ethnicities. Atmiyata in Gujarat employs a stepped care approach using community-based volunteers who identify persons in distress, offer counseling support and enable access to social care benefits. Evaluation of the service indicates better general health, better quality of life and social functioning. Nayador in West Bengal works with local networks and volunteers who support homeless persons through their outreach program and enable access to food, clothing, counseling, shelter and housing. Home Again, a program of the Banyan in Tamil Nadu, facilitates residence options in regular neighborhoods while also offering graded levels of supportive services for persons with severe disabilities. It emphasizes sociocultural participation, neurodiversity, and normalization of mental health conditions. Peer leaders provide wisdom from their lived experience to support others in distress. The practice of open dialogue, a therapeutic practice that originated in Finland, runs through many programs in the guidance. This practice, conducted in homes or in service settings, combines individual and systemic family therapy with a focus on the centrality of relationships and promotion of connectedness through family and support networks. This approach trains the therapist in de-escalation of distress and breaks power differentials that allow for free expression. Aimed at providing newer perspectives to governments and policymakers, approaches in the new WHO guidance are designed to make community inclusion and dialogic practice a way of life. With emphasis on social care components such as workforce participation, pensions and housing, increased investments in health and social care seem imperative. A network of services. Recently, the Supreme Court and the Madras High Court have advised vaccinations for those in mental health care homes and for those homeless and living with a mental illness, while those in institutions should access this support at the earliest. For those homeless and who opt not to enter mental health establishments en masse from where exit pathways may be laborious, there are 2 paths. In the first, drives will be conducted and persons with mental illness will be housed in overcrowded institutions, with scant regard for agency or for social determinants of ill health. The other would aim to provide a network of services ranging from soup kitchens at vantage points to mobile mental health and social care clinics, non-intimidating guest homes at village panchayats with access to toilets and the comfort of a welcoming team, and well-being kiosks that offer a basic income and/or facilitate livelihoods. Small emergency care and recovery centers for those who need crisis support instead of larger hospitals, and long-term inclusive living options in an environment that values diversity and celebrates social mixing, will reframe the archaic narrative of how mental health care is to be provided. With a strong health system, Tamil Nadu is well placed to demonstrate through pilots, and an exclusive policy for homeless persons with mental illness, that political intent, good governance and creative thinking can solve complex problems and cater to the needs of the ultra-vulnerable. Meanwhile, A mental health service user whom we met interpreted her tattoo as, "We are all one." If we can learn to be on the same side as the mental health service user, it seems possible that we can learn to respect human diversity. Vandana Gopikumar is co-founder, The Banyan and The Banyan Academy. Keshav Desiraju serves on the board of the Banyan Academy and was Union Health Secretary, Government of India. Thank you. Editorial 6. Unpacking China's game plan. It is upgrading defense infrastructure in the Tibetan Plateau to nullify the disadvantages that its air power has vis-à-vis India. Aviation websites are abuzz with reports of a rapid upgradation of aviation infrastructure in Tibet. While the expansion of the road and railway network there has been subject to much debate, it is the speed of upgradation of airfields, construction of hardened aircraft shelters, new runways, aprons, underground storage and tunneling into mountain sides, all visible in high-resolution satellite photos, that should have alarm bells ringing in New Delhi. This needs an analysis for two reasons. First, is there any link between these constructions and the procrastination by China in the talks for reducing tensions in eastern Ladakh? What is the tactical aim of the Chinese with these upgradations? Second, how would these changes affect the balance of air power between the Indian Air Force, IAF, and People's Liberation Army Air Force, PALAF, in the medium to long term? On a weak wicket in the air. While the larger strategic aim of the Chinese in upping the ante by violating decades-old understandings in 2020 is still a matter of debate, what Beijing discovered to its discomfiture was that India did not yield any ground, and actually occupied vantage points in the South Pangong Tso area to balance out some sectoral disadvantages. This firmness was backed by deterrent IAF firepower, and it was clear to the Chinese that they were on a weak wicket in the air due to three reasons. First, the IAF's high strike potential, with its aircraft having the advantage of a string of airfields all along the foothills of the Himalayas, that they are at low altitudes permit a full armament load to be carried. Second, Chinese airfields in Tibet were few, widely spaced out and hence not mutually supportive. There were gaps in the air defense structure too that the IAF would utilize to interdict targets in the rear. Third, most Tibetan airfields are at altitudes above 10,000 feet, severely restricting the payload of PALAF aircraft. Additional infrastructure was required to make up these deficiencies since the positive asymmetry of IAF would be detrimental to China's plans to gain any territorial advantage. Time had to be made an ally in this endeavor. The balancing out of IAF's asymmetry was only possible through a rapid upgradation of airfield and air defense infrastructure. This would need 2 years at least. The Chinese plan has been cleverly implemented through what can only be called a tactical pause, obtained via talks that were commenced but have meandered since. A breakthrough in the eyeball-to-eyeball posture came in February when a simultaneous withdrawal in certain areas was agreed on, including a pulling back of Indian troops from their vantage points in areas south of Pangong Tso. With the threat to the PLA Moldo garrison removed, the Chinese readopted their procrastination position in subsequent talks regarding restoring status quo ante in Depsang Daulat Beg Oldi and Hot Springs, which are of vital interest to India. This is the classic buying time through talks technique and is still ongoing. In the tactical pause one surreptitiously, the Chinese have gone on the upgradation drive to nullify the disadvantages that Chinese air power has vis-à-vis India. Gaps in their air defense scheme are being plugged through the new infrastructure and positioning of new air defense radars and missile systems that would afford them a layered air defense setting and affect the balance of power in the medium to long term. Trying to turn the tables. The IAF is equipped and trained for offensive action. In all the previous conflicts, the IAF conducted aggressive strikes, besides providing active close support to ground forces. The odd exception was the 1962 India-China conflict, where the IAF's substantial strike potential was nullified by a political decision to not use it. The equipment accretion profile is appointed to the offensive role as seen by the acquisition of Jaguars, Mirage 2000, Sukhois and now the Rafale. Seen from the prism of air power doctrine, this points to India's strategy of deterrence by punishment. Don't mess with us as we have the means and power to hurt you. By strengthening their air defense architecture, the Chinese are trying to turn the tables and deter India through a strategy of denial, i.e., to dissuade the IAF by signaling that it would be costly in terms of aircraft and aircrew losses. For this turnaround to take effect would take China about 2 years. If China succeeds in its endeavor, India may lose the trump card of positive air power asymmetry that it now holds. What should India do? The air defense upgradation drive is surely being monitored, but that is not enough. If status quo ante on ground is not obtained soon, it may be too late a year or two from now. The facade of talks should be acknowledged for its devious aim. India's posture and demands at the talks, which one supposes has an IAF representative too, must reflect its understanding of China's game plan. There is no other way out. Manmohan Bahadur is a retired Air Vice Marshal. Editorial 7. Vacancies send a wrong signal. Leaving top posts in the government unoccupied affects governance and is demoralizing for officers. MP Nathaniel. The vacancies in the central government and the states in recent years have had a deleterious effect on governance. For months on end, top slots in important government agencies remain vacant. Delays in promotions and appointments not only affect the organizations but also tend to demoralize the officials who await promotions after vacancies arise. Posts waiting to be filled. The post of the chairman of the National Human Rights Commission was kept vacant until June this year, even though the previous chairman, H. L. Dattu, retired in December 2020. The post of the director of the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, too was kept vacant until the recent appointment of Subodh Kumar Jaiswal. The post had been vacant since February after Rishi Kumar Shukla retired. The Chief Election Commissioner, CEC, Sunil Arora, retired on April 12 amidst an aggressive election campaign and polling in West Bengal and 4 other states this year, leaving just 2 members in the commission. One of them became CEC by virtue of his seniority in the Election Commission. In case of a disagreement on any issue between the two of them, a solution would have become difficult. The centre appointed Anup Chandra Pandey as the new election commissioner in June. Meanwhile, the Association for Democratic Reforms, ADR, has filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court demanding the appointment of election commissioners by a committee, as is done in the case of appointment of the director of the CBI, and not by the centre as is the case now. ADR has referred to the 255th report of Law Commission that had recommended that election commissioners be appointed by a high-powered committee. Though the high-powered committee headed by the Prime Minister has 2 members, the Chief Justice of India and the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha, the opposition leader has little say in the selection process. If the Prime Minister decides on a candidate and the CJI consents, the opposition leader's dissenting note carries no weight. There is a need, therefore, to expand the high-powered committee to include at least 2 more members of eminence with proven integrity for the selection process, preferably a retired police officer and a chief minister of a state governed by a party other than that of the party of the Prime Minister. After Hrishikesh Senapati's retirement in November last, the National Council of Educational Research and Training, which is largely responsible for chalking out the education policy of the country, is headless. Of the 40 central universities across the country, nearly half are without regular vice-chancellors. Rakesh Asthana assumed additional charge of the Narcotics Control Bureau, NCB, from December 2019. After his appointment as Director General, DG, of the Border Security Force in August last, he continues to hold charge of the NCB as DG. Kuldeep Singh, DG of the Central Reserve Police Force, now also heads the National Investigation Agency after the previous incumbent, YC Modi, retired on May 31 last. Impact of vacancies. Similar vacancies or examples of officers holding additional charge exist in other ministries, commissions and departments, but the government appears to turn a blind eye to the malefic effect it has on governance. Vacancies for such long periods tend to paralyze the backbone of these organizations. Appointments to higher echelons can be announced well in time. Delays in important appointments send a wrong signal to the nation. If the government can announce its chiefs and vice-chiefs months in advance, there is no reason why this cannot be done in all other ministries and departments. A time frame needs to be worked out to announce top appointments at least a month in advance. Political considerations need to be pushed to the back seat for a clean and honest administration. MP Nathaniel is Inspector General of Police, retired, CRPF. Thank you. 50 years ago, 7th July 1971, the future for English in Mysore. Hubli, July 6. English is not likely to continue as a compulsory subject for degree courses in universities in Mysore state. This change in the present pattern is likely to be brought about consequent on the introduction of the 2-year pre-university course throughout the state. According to the PUC syllabus, students are required to take any 2 languages, not necessarily English. The possibility of universities making suitable modifications in the pattern of education for degree courses was indicated here yesterday by Professor D. Java Govda, Vice-Chancellor of Mysore University and Chairman of the specially constituted Pre-University Board which manages pre-university classes throughout the state from this year. The 1-year PUC hitherto run by the universities in the state is now being run by the board. When his attention was drawn to the confusion created by the anomaly in pre-university syllabus where English was not compulsory, and that of the syllabus for degree courses of the universities where English was compulsory, Professor Java Govda stated that as all the vice-chancellors were members of the pre-university board and hence party to the decision regarding the syllabus, they had now got to suitably change the syllabus for the degree course to provide for admissions of students who pass the PUC without offering English. 100 years ago, 7th July 1921 resolutions. Calcutta, July 6. At today's meeting of the Bengal Legislative Council 8 resolutions were discussed, 2 of which were negatived and 6 carried. The only important resolution which was discussed at some length urged the local government to request the Government of India to include the Darjeeling district within the reforms scheme for the province of Bengal. Sir Henry Wheeler gave reasons why Darjeeling was excluded from the reform scheme and said that the question would be reopened after 2 years. That was 6 months before the next elections. The resolution was carried. Replying to a question with reference to the conversation between Mr. K.C. De Divisional Commissioner and Babu Akil Chunderduk regarding Assam coolies as published in newspapers, the Honorable Sir Henry Wheeler said that the conversation as published was inaccurate. Mr. De made no statement to the effect that he proposed to fight the non-cooperation movement with Gorkhas. Thank you. Faith. Prarabdha Karma. Sastras advised that an individual desirous of salvation should learn to gradually dissociate himself from the active involvements that he had been preoccupied with and begin to meditate on God with single-minded devotion, at least during the last lap of his life. The Lord's word in the Bhagavad Gita, that one can reach him if only one is able to think of him at the time of death, provides the motivation to make it a practice to meditate on him in earnest at all times. But even for one steeped in bhakti yoga, to resist the pulls of attachment that might casually come in one's way can become a difficult task, is what the Jada Bharat episode very vividly illustrates, pointed out Sri R. Krishnamurti Sastrigal in a discourse. Bharatha's compassionate nature towards the young orphaned deer had very subtly morphed into strong emotional attachment, and this interfered with his usual daily practice of austerities. Instead of fixing his mind on God, which had been his aim when he chose to live in solitude, he remembered the deer all the while, so much so that this thought alone prevailed at the time of death. He was then born as a deer in his next birth. Interpreters feel that the prarabdha karma in his account took the form of this newfangled attachment to the deer. The same prarabdha continued in his next birth, but now, though a deer, he was granted the knowledge of his past life. He became aware of the long years of penance he had spent in archana, aradhana and meditation, and how this had taken a diversion. Brooding thus, the deer moved away from its herd and travelled towards the hermitage to wait for the end of its life. In the next birth, he was born as the realized Jada Bharat and attained salvation at the end of his life. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this video as a podcast. Do like, share and comment. Press the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to get new notifications. Thank you. Take care and stay safe. God bless you all. Jai Maa Bharti. To download news and editorials in MP3, follow us on Telegram, Virtual School Official. The link is provided in the description below.